Shalom, Holy Blossom. I have been grappling with something for a number of weeks now and have only been able to speak about it to those closest to me, some family and some dear colleagues. The Reform movement, you may have read in the Jewish press, is struggling with serious allegations of serious ethical breaches of many kinds, from the outright criminal to the immoral to what I call the creepy and the unkind. Most of these allegations refer to things that happened 2 decades ago or more. They point to a time when some behaviors were tolerated, swept under the rug, or met with shrugged shoulders. What was accepted then was never acceptable. And now the leaders of our Reform movement are all standing up to say, not on our watch. The 3 major institutions of our North American Reform movement are our seminary, Hebrew Union College, our rabbinical organization, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and our umbrella organization of all Reform congregations, the Union for Reform Judaism. They have now, at great expense, taken up thorough, independent investigations to understand what happened to whom and by whom, to understand what was known and what was covered up, what decisions were made, and what was deliberately or inadvertently ignored, to give rise to a culture of tolerance for hurtful behaviors enacted by people entrusted with positions of authority. So why now, you might ask? Well, we've learned a lot in the last 5 years or so. We have learned from the Me Too movement. We have learned from the Black Lives Matter movement. We have learned from Professor Christine Ford. We have learned from George Floyd. We have learned what it is to bear witness, what it is to give testimony, what it is to wrestle with ghosts long gone, but still very real. We have learned from mass shooting after brutal mass shooting, how callousness can be calculated and cultivated. How we can be trained not to care, or how to care less. Out of the Trump era, when every ugly, hurtful thing was daily news, came a new set of criteria, a new grassroots pact among many about what would be tolerated and what would no longer be tolerated. There is a new understanding that by keeping silent, one perpetuates the problem, actually becomes part of the problem. A direct or indirect outcome from the trauma of the Trump presidency and unchecked police brutality, we now have a new vocabulary about gatekeeping and microaggressions and unconscious biases. We have new training in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why are we now opening up old wounds and opening up old files? I do think the pandemic has something to do with it as well. Throughout this year, we feel our frailty. When our resistance is down and we have time to reflect, the pain that was once suppressed now rises to the surface again for many. What has been compartmentalized and put away for decades is now being re-examined and reconsidered in new light. I've struggled with the problem itself, and I've struggled with how to speak of it with you, my congregation. For one, I know everyone is depleted these days. Now in our 3rd wave of lockdown, I see how everyone is struggling to keep from dipping into despair, and I believe part of my job now is to protect you from that. Every day, Holy Blossom Temple provides spiritual uplift and emotional support to hundreds of people, young and old, to see us through this very difficult and fragile time. It won't last forever, God knows, but we are still in the thick of it now. And so I hate to bring this message to you for fear that your already heavy hearts might break. I also have hesitated to bring this to you because by nature I tend to retreat from Lashon Hara, from evil talk, even when it is true talk. Growing up in a rabbinic home, I learned at a very young age how to keep confidences, how to treat people's stories with extra care, how not to engage in gossip. These lessons were never even articulated, but were simply learned by observing how my parents and grandparents cared for their congregants. As a 4th-generation rabbi, I also learned to love rabbis. My father toiled 11 years to be granted a PhD. from the HUC faculty, and he never complained. He only drank in the wisdom that they could offer him. And he traveled great distances to visit his teachers when they were sick or to attend their funerals. My grandfather's life was literally saved when, as a young man in Nazi Germany, he sought guidance from Rabbi Leo Beck, who sent him to Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. Years later, my grandfather marched in Selma with his favorite teacher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So I was raised to thank God for our rabbis and teachers, these giants of justice, giants of intellect, and vessels and emblems of living Torah. The news of the day now stands in painful opposition to that. From a Jewish values point of view, this recent conversation is complex and ought to be complex. When does running from Lashon Hara become granting permission? When does taking care not to shame someone in public become a cover-up? When does believing that teshuvah is possible protect the wrongdoer and cause additional hurt and harm to the one who was wronged? When does not speaking ill of the dead become a roadblock to transparency? When does Kavod Harav, honoring rabbis and teachers, condone wrongdoing, the wrongdoing we don't want to believe is true? When ought forgiveness be granted, and who gets to decide? Our Jewish values must be part of the algorithm that will bring our Jewish community to health and healing now. But how? I've chosen not to desecrate Shabbat with this conversation, but rather to speak of it through this pre-Shabbat reflection. A few weeks ago, when an HUC professor died, students came forward with diametrically opposed testimonials about the same man. Some were academically nurtured and mentored by him. Others were humiliated and more demoralized by him. Both are true. Some students experienced HUC as an institution of higher learning devoted to the free exchange of ideas, a celebration of liberal thinking and courageous truth-telling about Jewish text, about Jewish history, about Jewish theology. Others experienced the very same campus as discriminatory, the very same faculty as cruel, the very same curriculum as narrow-minded and outdated. Both experiences are true. Last week, the news broke that the man who ordained me has a record of decades of sexual wrongdoing, including against minors. The person who gave me smicha and made me a rabbi through the ritual of publicly placing his hands on my head and my shoulders before the open ark and before the eyes of God. Now I know that he abused his position and his title of rabbi repeatedly to hurt people. To be honest, I don't know what to do with this information. I only ever knew him to be a great model of a rabbi and teacher. Nevertheless, I am sufficiently rattled by what has been revealed, and it's going to take me some time to figure out what it means and doesn't mean for me. This man, this accomplished rabbi, this leader of the Jewish people and the Reform movement has done a lot of good in his lifetime. I pray that God will account every merit for the good. And he has done serious direct harm and far-reaching indirect harm. He is, in a word, human. Our Mishnah teaches that to save a life is to save a world entire, and to destroy a life is to destroy a world entire. This human being with masterful teaching skills and countless kindnesses has saved worlds. This human being with dangerous impulses and faulty judgment has destroyed worlds. Both are true. There are questions about individual accountability as well as institutional accountability. Last week, you may have read in the local press, a case was reopened here in Toronto While the Orthodox rabbi was sent to jail long ago, now his victim is rightly asking what responsibilities must be borne by the synagogue and its leadership, which failed to protect its children. I have been fortunate with only good experiences of HUC, the CCAR, and the URJ. Now these sister organizations of the Reform movement and a number of its synagogues are taking a hard look and inquiring what culture was created here that may have provided cover, that may have protected the powerful and failed to protect the vulnerable. And most importantly, what needs to change for the future. When justice and ethics are the hallmark of the Reform movement, we must be as honest and as strategic about confronting internal injustices as we are about calling out external injustices. My only comfort in all this is found in our approach to Torah itself. We treat a Sefer Torah as we treat a human being. When a synagogue is on fire, we rescue the Torah scrolls as if they were living beings. A Sefer Torah is unlike any other object, unlike any other holy book. We take care to keep it covered so that it is unexposed and its dignity always intact. We take care in how we touch it, only with a yad, so it will not be smeared or soiled. We take care in how we hold it upright, how we accompany its comings and goings, never leaving it unprotected. We even sing serenades of pride and praise as it travels from place to place. And yet this same Torah is flawed. We liberal Jews are not afraid to admit that this Torah is filled with both wisdom and falsehood. Its verses are both sources of protection and pain. Its laws build fences for good and for harm. Its words are expressions of love and loyalty as well as violence and discrimination. We liberal Jews are willing to say, sometimes in shame, that law was once accepted and necessary, but today I can see that it is unjust, immoral, or simply unkind. We liberal Jews are willing to say, sometimes through tears, that mitzvah was once beloved and believed to be a true expression of divine will. But we have grown since then as a civilization, as a people. With God's abundant blessings, we are now able to see that some of these mitzvot must be set down. And we must say, no longer will I carry that source of hurt or hate. And if we treat a Torah scroll like a person, let us also treat a person like a Torah scroll. Just as we do not edit out the verses that offend, we do not erase people either. Instead of deleting the words we cannot tolerate, we comment on them. We do our best to interpret them, to learn from them, to make new law from them. We must try to understand something important from the people, the leaders, and the teachers who we now see more fully. In this week's double Torah portion, Bahar Bechukotai, on a mountain in my laws, there are verses tinged with old tribal language about human slavery, for example. In traditional synagogues, every word of this parsha is read, even the curses, though sometimes only in a whisper. We liberal Jews usually choose instead to sing only the verses which enlighten and uplift and elevate, but we still carry the irrelevant and irreverent verses as part of the whole Torah. We do not deny the complexity nor the sacredness of the whole and holy Torah, which comes to testify against the best and the worst of what it is to be human. This Shabbat we complete the book of Leviticus, which is all about how to discern between purity and impurity, between what is clean and what is unclean, between what is permitted and what is forbidden, between what is sacred and what is profane. With that accumulation of learning, we conclude with the prayer, Chazak, Chazak v'nitchazek. Be strong, and let us strengthen one another. Shabbat Shalom.